Why did Europeans colonize Africa and not vice versa? To understand why Africa is the poorest continent, it is necessary to comprehend the geographical, biological, climatic, historical and political barriers of the African continent. Africa is the largest continent, although it often doesn't appear so on maps due to the Mercator projections used to create geographical maps, especially bidimensional maps. Mercator projection shrink regions near the equator, the tropical regions such as Africa, and large regions near the poles, which is why Russia and Canada appear larger than they actually are. In the image you see, Africa is shown in its real size and the states it can contain. It is so vast that it can contain the United States, China, India, and Europe, and some more. But despite Africa being the largest continent in the world, it is the poorest. The majority of its inhabitants live on less than $1 a day. What have been and are the barriers that have led to such a discrepancy, a divergence between Europe and Africa? This will be the central question of this video. As we will see, geographical features have played a central role in creating this divide, more than many other variables. The more a geographic region can meet the nutritional needs of a population, of course, the more a population can grow, specializing in technical areas beyond hunting, gathering, and farming. Although Africa is larger than Europe, the length of its coast is much shorter than that of Europe and any other continent. This is a paradox, but this is due to the lack of indentation in the African coast, which Europe is rich in. This indentation hosts numerous natural harbors where ships can dock in Europe, protected from the stormy waters of the open sea. This coastal anatomy allowed European nations to become maritime powers very early in their history. An important indicator for giving you a number of the access to the sea routes is that while 30% of Europe is composed of islands and peninsulas, think about Italy, only 2% of Africa consists of islands and peninsulas. In addition to the scarcity of natural harbors, we must consider the shallow coastal waters in sub-Saharan Africa, which force maritime trade into complex and costly, expensive offshore anchoring operation, and the consequent use of small boats to unload the content of large ships and then go to the coast. Indeed, only small boats can reach the coast due to the shallow coastal waters. To the scarcity of natural harbors and the presence of shallow coastal waters, we have another hydrological limitation: the scarcity of navigable rivers that can allow access to the interior region from the coast. The navigability of African rivers is hindered by multiple factors. In many cases, the river deltas, when they open to the sea, are blocked by sand barriers. The low amount and irregular frequency of rains fills the river to a navigable depth intermittently, and even when full, most rivers are navigable only with small boats. Some rivers that have water depth compatible with navigation present a huge problem: waterfalls and rapids that impede traffic. Let's give you an example. The Zaire River is 4,200 kilometers long. It's the second largest African river for length after the Nile. Unfortunately, the rapids and waterfalls near the sea prevent ships coming from the ocean from navigating it to reach the interior. Only the Niles allows navigation from the sea inland. And in support of what I'm saying, Egypt was an important area for the development of a human civilization. And even today, Cairo and Alexandria of Egypt are the largest city in Africa, with 10 million and 5 million inhabitants respectively. Another example, the Niger River, the most important and navigable river in West Africa, is not navigable by large vessels, and is not navigable at all in many stretches due to rapids. Furthermore, in the dry season, its depth can drop to just 4 meters. The very few rivers navigable from the coast to inland lead to internal areas that are not very productive and useful for offering some trade. The Senegal River, again to the problem of seasonal rains, is navigable only for a few months. And the seasonality of the rivers in West Africa is very important and is linked to the complete absence of mountains and orographic limitation. So the absence of snow impede to maintain the river levels in the dry seasons. What happens in Europe, for example? Thus, the African rivers depends exclusively on the availability of rain. Since most of Africa is made up of plateaux, the rivers descend towards the sea with steep slopes, making it difficult for ships to go up them. To give some numbers, the Amazon River descends only 6 meters during its last 800 kilometers towards the sea, while the Zaire River descends 300 meters in the last 500 kilometers towards the sea. And this makes the interior of Africa impenetrable to most large ships. For the above reasons, Africans have never had a significant maritime fleet, except in North Africa, which faced the Mediterranean Sea, and a small portion of Eastern Africa, where these previously mentioned limitations are not so severe. And therefore, much of Africa developed in the absence of economical stimuli and cultural exchanges offered by maritime traffic, of which Europe and Asia took advantage. Another factor to consider is the distances from the coast to the center of Africa that are much greater than in Europe. In Europe, no inland area is more than 800 kilometers from the sea. But many areas in Africa are more than 1,600 kilometers from the sea. So far, we have considered the difficulties of maritime traffic. But rail transport has not been easier, because the same presence of plateaus and significant differences in altitude that made many rivers unnavigable by ships has complicated or even impeded the construction of important railway lines. But let's not think that land transport, with or without animals, has been so easy, because owing to climatic and biological factors, there are a lot of hindrances. On one side, the presence of an enormous Sahara Desert, which divides Africa into two parts, as it were an ocean. On the other hand, the presence of trypanosomiasis, also known as sleeping sickness, which has made the use of pack animals impractical in many places, owing to the loss of muscular power. Geographical barriers are compounded by biological and climatic barriers, which are closely connected to geography, because geography influences climate and climate influences some biological factors. Indeed, the tropical climate of much of Africa contributes to the spread of some infectious diseases transmitted by vectors, insects, such as trypanosomiasis and malaria. Trypanosomiasis, transmitted by the tsetse fly, affects both humans and animals. The resulting lack of muscular power from this disease has been a huge problem, not only for the transport, as we mentioned earlier, but also for agriculture, because owing to the scarcity of the power of animals for the sleeping sickness, there is not much power for plowing and there is a lack of fertilizer. Malaria, transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito, affects 200 million of Africans a year, causing the death of 5 million people a year. But besides trypanosomiasis and malaria, there is an enormous list of infectious diseases ravaging the African continent, such as HIV and tuberculosis, just for citing a few. The tropical climate also favors soil erosion due to the drought alternating with sudden torrential rains. Erosion, as you know, impoverishes arable land and forces the population to move continuously in search of better lands, with the lack of stability a primary requirement of great civilizations. The Sahara Desert, as mentioned earlier, is an enormous physical barrier between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, and is a major limiting factor for agriculture. What can you culture there? Africa, unlike Eurasia, which develops in latitude, has the greatest longitudinal geographic axis. This means that while Eurasia, which extends from west to east, has a similar climate, Africa has enormous climatic variation from north to south. In Africa, there are 4 major climatic zones: equatorial, near the equator, which is the rainforest environment; tropical, above and below the equator, which is what we call savanna environment; arid, the desert environment, we find them in Sahara in the north and Kalahari and Namibia in the south; and a Mediterranean climate along the Mediterranean coast and in the southern region in South Africa, which is a temperate environment. But what does it mean having all these climate zones? Means that especially at the dawn of agriculture, it was not possible to transport crops from north to south due to such different climatic conditions. So when you discover something in the north, you cannot move this kind of culture in the south. In contrast, in Eurasia, thanks to the similar climatic environment, an agricultural discovery could easily move from the Silk Road to Europe and vice versa, from the Middle East to Europe and vice versa. This allowed for a more rapid development of the Eurasian continent. And the same limitation of the African continent is also found in the Americas, which also have a vertical development. Indeed, it was not the case that Native Americans didn't colonize Europe, but were the Europeans who colonized the Americas, as happened with Africa. So this highlights how geography is very important. But to worsen the already precarious geographical, climatic, and biological condition of African continent, Europeans intervened. European colonialism and the slave trade exacerbated the already present fragilities of Africa. Over 200 years, 50 million young Africans were deported as slaves to the Americas by the English, Spanish, and Portuguese. European colonialists divided Africa by creating arbitrary borders that did not reflect the cultural and social differences of the resident population. And at the end of colonialism, which in most cases was a violent and bloody event, Africa found itself with old geographic, climatic problems, biological problems, and a new induced by colonialism, corruption, precarious political system, extreme damage to the social fabric, apartheid, monetary and financial exploitation. So, all that we said so far explain the very low population density in sub-Saharan Africa, which is sadly the lowest in the world. Despite Africa has been the first continent inhabited by us, Homo sapiens. For giving you numbers, the population density is just 30 inhabitants per square kilometers in sub-Saharan Africa, compared to 150 inhabitants per square kilometers in Europe and China. So I hope this discussion about the cradle of Homo sapiens can provide you with useful information for formulating a more balanced and constructive judgment about the African continent and migration flows.